The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight on The Agenda.
I thought I won the lottery for sure this time. This time, this is the real lottery that I won. It's not a fake lottery like going to live with my mom. This was the deal because I get to go to Canada.
Then, later tonight.
To really cut through, the greatest threat to Lake Simcoe is political will, the lack of political will.
You probably know our next guest as one of the dragons on the CBC show Dragon's Den. What you may not know is that there is a remarkable story behind his current success on Bay Street, a story that starts with unimaginable poverty. He's told his story in a memoir entitled No Bootstraps When You're Barefoot: My Rise from a Jamaican Plantation Shack to the Boardrooms of Bay Street. And with that, we welcome Wes Hall to our studio. It's great to see you.
Steve, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
I want to start telling your story here because it's shocking. It's shocking where you started compared to where you have ended up now. So let's go back. Your mom is 28 years old.
Yeah.
She's got 7 kids, and she abandons all of you.
Yes.
You're 18 months old. How did you do it?
Well, that's the thing when you're 18 months, I had no choice. You know, she just, she boiled a pot of porridge and she left it. And my sister was 4 years old. So she must have told her that, by the way, when the kids are hungry, feed them. And my brother was 6 months old. So there we are, 3 of us in that house, the rest of the kids with my grandmother. And she never came back. And so as an 18-month-old kid, I'm hungry. And so Ian and I started to cry, like really loudly. And my sister Joan, again, only 4 years old, didn't know what to do because the pot was empty. And a neighbor came by and heard the commotion, came in, walked to the threshold of the house, because it's a 1-bedroom place. You can see what's inside.
In Jamaica.
In Jamaica. In rural Jamaica, and realized that these kids were by themselves in this place.
Your father was not there?
My father was not there. My father left when I was 1 to come to Canada. And he was a 24-year-old man, and he'd go, I want to discover the world, and, you know, Golden Grove, Jamaica wasn't big enough for me. He had ambitions of his own, and he left. So I was 1 year old, and I stayed with my mother. And as you mentioned, my mother had multiple children, and we were the last of the lot at the time. She had 2 other kids since then, so she had a total of 9 kids.
Your grandmother saved the day, though.
My grandmother was amazing. So when that man came, the man was going by on a bicycle and heard, and he stopped and came by, and he goes, okay, I'm going to go get your grandmother. And he took off on his bicycle, and the story's been told to me, and it's passed down. He took off on his bicycle, went to the plantation, and he got my grandmother. And my grandmother came with my older sister, Barbara, and a trolley, and loaded us up and took us to the plantation house that she was raising the rest of the kids, the grandkids.
Now, your mother would drop into your life from time to time in future years.
Yeah.
Why is it that your grandmother never read your mother the riot act about taking care of her own children?
My grandmother kind of did, but didn't. Because, so my grandmother would, you know, she would say, listen, you need to take care of your own responsibility, right? So my mother would stop coming to see us. And so she didn't really want to go too hard on her because then she would just never come at all. And so she would, you know, you need to look after your kids, you need to, but then she would just pull back. And even with that, my mother would only show up literally to see us for like about 10 or 15 minutes.
Until the day when she finally showed up and said, Wes,
yeah,
you're coming with me.
You're anointed. You know, you are anointed to come to live with me.
Now, what precipitated that?
I didn't know at the time. But...
And you're how old when this happened?
11. So everybody was saying, take one of the girls. The boy will look after himself. He's going to work on the plantation. He's going to be fine. But your girls are going to get pregnant, and you need to protect them. So take one of the girls, and she wouldn't have any of it. She would go, nope, I want Wes. I want Wes. And I thought I won the lottery.
You didn't, Wes.
I did not win the lottery.
Wes, she beat you. She humiliated you. She was a misery to you.
Yeah.
Why? Did you ever get to the bottom of why?
You know, I'd never understood it, and later on I start to think, why would someone behave this way? Someone who should love you unconditionally, who actually hated you by the way they treated you. And then I start to think about how much love she had for my father. My father was the one who got away. She had all these men that came into her life, impregnate her, and then they would leave. But my dad was this man that was special. He was athletic, he was young, he was good looking. And she had him. And all the girls in the neighborhood wanted that man. And she had him. But he didn't want her.
She cracked your head open once.
She did. I still have the scar in the back of my head.
Why didn't you run away after that?
You know, it's funny because I ran away shortly before that happened. I literally couldn't take it anymore, and it's got to be I was about maybe 12 years old, and I ran away back to St. Thomas with my grandmother, and that was an experience. And it's almost like you're held hostage, and then you try to escape, and then you're caught. There are consequences when you try to escape and you get caught. Well, that's what happened, because after I ran away, my mother came to get me, and there were consequences after. So it was an unwritten rule after that don't even try this again.
Well, here's something she said to you. She looked at you and she said, "You're black, you're ugly, and you're not mine." Now, that is a terrible thing for any mother to say to anybody.
For anyone to say to anybody at all.
Right, right.
Right.
Have you forgiven your mother for all of this over the years?
Oh, absolutely. I have, because there's no reason why you should harbor resentment. My grandmother taught me that. My grandmother wasn't resentful to any of her kids for leaving all their kids with her to look after on a plantation worker salary. She never a day was resentful, nor did she resent us as a result. So she epitomizes forgiveness. So to me, I wanted to be like her.
And you really did it.
And I did. My grandmother had 4 children, all with the same man. And when that man became an alcoholic, she kicked him out of the house, because she'd go, "I don't want you to corrupt my kids, my grandkids." She kicked him out. He would show up every now and then and hang out with us and so on, but she would have nothing to do with him at all. And she looked after those 4 kids on her own, and then they became adults. But one of those kids was special needs, my Aunt Daphne. And she looked after her until the day she died at 97 years old. My grandmother died at 97.
Amazing.
She was committed. And so she wasn't promiscuous. She didn't abuse us. So I spent almost 11 years watching that behavior. And that informed the person that I would become later on in life.
You figured out right from wrong by watching.
I figured
your
that out
grandmother.
really quickly. I figured out how to behave. She never treated us poorly. She never let us feel as if we're a burden, to her. But yet, when I went to live with my mom, I was a burden. I was clearly a burden, but I couldn't understand why she would want to keep me around. Until I found out later on, was my dad, who was in Canada, that she was pining for all this time, saying, "Where's Wes? Wes is still at the grandmother's. You need to go get him, and he needs to be with you."
Well, eventually, 1985, you do come to Canada to be with your father.
Yeah.
And to meet a bunch of siblings that you didn't really know at all.
Didn't know.
How did that transition go from Jamaica to Toronto?
Well, it was interesting, because when I was in Jamaica, my mom kicked me out at 13, so that's when all the abuse and the beating stopped, and it was the happiest day of my life, by the way, because even though I was only 13 years old and I didn't know where I was going to live, I knew that I wouldn't be subjected to all the things that she was subjecting me to before, the physical and mental abuse that she was putting me through. And at 16, living on your own, in 13 to 16, and then 16 years old, my dad goes, "Hey, I want you to come live with me. And I thought I won the lottery for sure this time. This time, this is the real lottery that I won. It's not a fake lottery like going to live with my mom. This was the deal because I get to go to Canada. It wasn't that I get to go to live with my dad this time. Before it was, I get to go live with my mother. This time, I get to go to Canada. And that was the golden ticket for me.
This is 37 years ago now.
This is 37 years ago.
And you show up with that accent.
I did.
What did people think of that?
Well, everybody I said, well, what can't understand him. I said, they couldn't. So I went to, September 27th, 1985, I came here on a Friday. And on Monday, I was in school. And as you know, when you go to school, before you get to your classes, you meet with the guidance counselor, and they pick your subjects for you. They put me in the ESL program, English as a second language.
And to be clear, it was your first language.
It was my first language.
But it sounded different from everybody else. Okay.
It had a little accent on it that the guidance counselor goes, I don't know what this guy I can't understand this kid.
Well, in fact, there's an expression you use in the book, and you'll say it better than I will, because I'd never heard it before. Bust me cock?
Bust me cock.
What is that?
So this is an instrument, a weapon that my dad had, where it's made of leather, and it's usually salted and soaked to make it really firm and thick. And that's something that he uses to administer discipline when we're out of line.
So he hit you with
as children, yes, as a young man, And the expression, I think, came from, well, if you think you're a man, I'm going to use this to let you know that you're not a man anymore. And so the bust me cock is a thing that Jamaican, parents use to children, and it should be outlawed, quite frankly. It should be.
Okay, you get a bunch of jobs once you're done school and you're in Toronto. You get a job at a chicken factory. Eventually, you move up to a mailroom at a law firm, which is a pretty good job, Stikeman Elliott, one of the big law firms in town. And at some point, somebody says, you'll never become a clerk here at the law firm. Mm-hmm. What did you infer when they said that to you?
I looked around the department, and all I saw were women in the department. There were no guys in the department. So I figured they just don't hire men to be law clerks in this company. The guys are lawyers, because it's mostly men were lawyers at the time, and women were law clerks. And so I got that as a message that you're not going to be a law clerk here because you're a man.
So you didn't infer it's the color of my skin that's a problem.
I did not infer racism. But here's the difference in my case. And I didn't start to really put my finger on racism until way into my career. See, when I was in Jamaica, I saw black school teachers, black principals, black lawyers, black judges, black business people, everybody that are in powers of influence. The prime minister was black. The parliament members were black. Everybody were black people, for the most part. And so the only thing prevented me from being one of those people was poverty. My grandmother couldn't afford to send me to school to learn, to be educated, to become a lawyer, a judge, a politician. And when I came to Canada, that condition was cured. I no longer had that because education was free. I had the right to go to high school. And if I'm smart enough, I can get a scholarship to go to university. So to me, my color was never an obstacle, just my poverty was. So when someone sent the message to me that you're not going to be here because, I filled in that because I'm a guy, because I'm dressed too fancy.
But that may not be what they meant.
But that later on, looking back, you knew that the sign was very obvious because my brothers and sisters who were born here would know exactly what that meant and would have gone, okay, I got to leave this profession because I'm not going to get anywhere.
You continued to work your way up the food chain, 5 years at Can West. Then you moved to CIBC Mellon. You're managing white guys who are twice as old as you are. How'd that go?
I remember my, one of the guys was managing in my mid-20s, and he was 55. He's as old as I am now. And I could see how he would take exception to that. This young kid, he's been with the company for 30 years, and he now has to report to me. And so he had a problem with that. But then I put myself in his shoes. But he was just giving me the gears every single day. Every single day, he would pack up his bags and he would do it loudly so everybody would see early, and he would just walk out. And so I go, you know what? I need him more than he needs me. I had a job that I was really over my head. I didn't know how to do. And he's been doing that job for 30 years, and I just started. So I'm gonna get him to be an ally. I have to befriend him. So him and I had a come to Jesus conversation, and I just allowed him to be the boss. So when he walked into a room, automatically clients would assume that he was the boss. He was a middle-aged white man with gray hair, and I was a mid-20s black guy. Automatically, they would assume that he is the boss. So I gave them that impression, and I took notes, and he would run the meetings. And ultimately, he started to give me nuggets of knowledge. Wes, here's how you should behave in this situation. When he asked this question, here's how you should respond. And that's how I learned. You know, my ego didn't allow me to prevent myself from learning and moving ahead.
Well, at one point, you came to the conclusion, and this is a quote from the book, being black is my superpower, you said. What did that mean?
It means that in a lot of cases, people underestimate you because of the color of your skin, or me anyways, and they put their guards down. They don't bring their A game. They just go, he's uneducated, he's not as smart, all the different things that come into their minds when they think about what a black person can or can't do. And so I'm in an industry whereby if you underestimate somebody, it's just like in a ring with Mike Tyson. You underestimate them, you're gonna be...
You pay for it.
You're gonna be on your back.
Yeah.
And then you're gonna find out when they put smelling salt in front of you and you get up and you go, what just happened? Well, you had your hand behind your back and you were being cocky.
But the fact that you managed to go from working in a chicken factory to, and I'm not even going to get to where you are right now, but you moved up the food chain pretty quickly. You know, for a 20-something black kid from Jamaica, you did pretty well. To what do you attribute that success?
You know, after writing the book and then reading it, I went, how did this happen? How did this happen? Everybody goes, tell me, Wes, tell me, give me the secret to your success. I don't think I had any secrets other than the fact that I was able to exploit every single opportunity that was put in front of me, every single one of them.
And you were ambitious.
I was ambitious, but think about, you know, when people say the chicken farm, right? You know, you work at a chicken farm, I can't believe that. Well, that opportunity could have led me to be the general manager of the chicken farm and potentially the CEO of the company if I'm smart enough.
Right.
If I'm smart enough and I'm ambitious enough. So it doesn't really matter where you start. So I started in the mailroom. And a lot of people would go, I would never start in the mailroom. But guess what? Look where it got me. So I was able to exploit every single opportunity presented to me when others would go, I would never do that.
There is another line in your book where you say, I can tell you for a fact, black people know when it's about race. How do you know?
So I'm driving my car. I have a Ferrari 458 Spider. And I'm driving to the office. I was dressed like this without a tie on. And somebody stopped my car, handed me his business card and go, I'm a criminal lawyer in the city of Toronto. Give me a call if you're looking for a lawyer. Is that about race? I drive that car to the Four Seasons to have lunch with a client. I get out and somebody hand me $20 to valet their car for them. Is that about race? I go to the, I'm traveling, go to the airport, walk into the priority line. Just before I hand in my boarding pass, you're in the wrong line. You need to be in the economy line. Is that about race? So a lot of people have explanations to say, maybe it's because you were dressed this way. Maybe it's because your car was too flashy. Maybe.
You forgot the best story. You're jogging in your neighborhood with your wife. Tell that story.
I'm jogging through my neighborhood and my, people would say, could I use your personal trainer one day? To my wife.
They think you're her personal
They think
trainer.
I'm my wife's personal trainer. Or they come to my house and go get Mr. Hall for me. Or they ask me, are you the security guard? So again, you can excuse those behavior every now and then, but all of a sudden, when they just keep on adding on and adding on and piling on, you go, it's got to be about race. I'm not that naive to think that people are that ignorant.
In which case, you start something called Black North Initiative.
Yeah.
What's that?
So after George Floyd was murdered, I wrote an article, and it was published in one of the major newspapers. And it was on the front page. And it was entitled, When I Look in the Mirror, I See George Floyd. And in the article, I talked about me experiencing the effect that his murder had on me when I watched that video. And I looked and I stood up. Everybody was working remotely at the time, virtually. I was in my home office and I stood up after watching the video, and there's a mirror in front of me, and I literally saw George Floyd looking back at me. Because what I saw was how I would have been treated had I been in that situation. Nobody would care if I live in one of the fancy neighborhoods in the city, if I work on Bay Street, what my bank account balance was. They wouldn't have cared. All they saw was a black man because he was driving a Mercedes-Benz, and I had one in my driveway. And nobody asked him any questions. So, but I also start to recount my experiences as a black person. And I talk about me jogging through my neighborhood, and a white woman fell in front of me. And I hesitated to help her because I was scared about the potential consequences of me trying to help her. What if she was disoriented? Then she started fighting me off. My neighbors were all white because I'm the only black person in the neighborhood. And then all of a sudden the police shows up. We know the stats with respect to how police treat black people. And I have no identification because I was out jogging. I hesitated and I asked the question of my neighbors, how many of you in my position would see someone in need and hesitated because of the potential consequences to you? And so when I wrote that article, I started to get a lot of inbound calls from a lot of corporate leaders saying, Wes, I didn't get it. How can I help you? And at the end of the day, I go, let's start this organization called the Canadian Council of Business Leaders Against Anti-Black Systemic Racism. It's a mouthful. Let's call it the Black North Initiative. And because we're all CEOs, let's agree that we're going to change the conversation within our own companies. And we're going to start at the C-suite level, the board level, the C-suite level, the pipeline, and all aspect. We're going to look around and go, are there black people here? And if there aren't, why not? And what are we going to do about it?
Well, this must happen to you all the time. You walk into a board meeting, you're the only black face in the room. Am I right?
Yes, it is very common, and it's still common today. And but I also know that there are a ton of very smart, capable black people in this country. I meet a lot of them. And a lot of them tell me that they just can't get the breaks. They just can't get it. See, I was pretty fortunate when I came here because I was able to meet, you remember I talk about exploiting every single opportunity? But you have to meet the right people to be able to exploit those opportunities. I could have been just like that person in the middle in saying, you'll never be a law clerk in this company. Well, that's the wrong person. But then when I got the job at CanWest, I met the right person. And that right person was able to say, I don't really care what you look like. You're smart, you're gonna get the break. And so I was able to maneuver my way throughout the system to meet some wrong people, put that aside, find the right person, embrace them, embrace what they're teaching me, and then use that to get to the next level.
There are going to be people who will listen to your story, may read the book, and they will say, look where he started, look where he is now. He's a, titan on Bay Street. He's got a great TV show. This story proves that Canada is not a racist country because otherwise he'd never been able to achieve what he achieved. Is that the wrong conclusion?
It is, because I would say point to another.
You are pretty unique, aren't you?
It's like, there's not too many. And so if it doesn't exist, there should be so many more of me out there.
Do you feel like a unicorn?
In some circles, but I also feel that I have a privilege when I'm in those positions of being a unicorn to now educate the people who are gracious enough to allow me in the room, to let them know why other people like me should be in the room as well.
Let's finish up on this. Black North Initiative. The idea's out there. You've asked corporate, you've asked political people for support to get it going, put some oomph into it. How's it going?
It's going amazing. When you look at corporate Canada today, the face of corporate Canada is very different than it was in 2020. 2 short years. Just look at the boards, look at the C-suite, look at the universities, the kids graduating, the kids getting jobs. Very different. However, there are some out there who believe that we haven't done enough. Because their expectation is that after 400 years of oppression, that it should be solved in 2 years by this organization, Black North.
Right.
That's an offense to all the Black people who fought so hard, Martin Luther King Jr. and others, who fought so hard to advance the ball, that we're going to start this organization, Black North, and racism is going to be eradicated in Canada for good in 2 years.
Yeah, maybe not.
Maybe not.
I want to show the cover of this book because that little 6, 7-year-old kid from Jamaica is now worth how much?
A little bit more than that.
A little bit more than he was worth back then. I can't thank you enough for coming in here and telling your story. The book is a great read. You are astonishing.
Well, Steve, thank you.
Plain and simple. No bootstraps when you're barefoot. Wes Hall. Thank you so much, Wes.
Steve, thanks for having me.
Lake Simcoe is the largest lake in southern Ontario outside of the Great Lakes and the 4th largest one completely within the provincial boundaries. With growing cities such as Barrie, Orillia, and Innisfil on its shores, it's long been home to First Nations communities, beloved as part of cottage country and vital for the rich farming lands all around it. Needless to say, that adds up to pressure. With us now on how well it's holding up, let's welcome Jonathan Scott, councillor for Ward 2 for the town of Bradford, West Gwillimbury. Dave Neeson, councillor, Ward 3 for the town of Georgina. Claire Malcolmson, executive director of the Rescue Lake Simcoe Coalition. And Margaret Profit, executive director of the Simcoe County Greenbelt Coalition. Hi to everyone.
Hi.
Thanks so much for coming in. I know you all came from far, and it's nice to have you in the studio. And Jonathan, give me a slap on the wrist, because I don't think I said West Gwillimbury correctly.
You got it right the second time.
I did. So it was the second time. But thanks so much for being here. Lots to get into. Before we start our discussion, I just wanted to go through some facts and figures of what Lake Simcoe means. Here's a map of Lake Simcoe with the communities of Orillia, Barrie, Innisfil, Bradford, West Gwillimbury, that's Jonathan's ward, Georgina, that's Dave's ward, Beaverton, and Georgina Island in the lake itself. And here are some numbers about the lake according to the Lake Simcoe Region Conservation Authority. It is 722 square kilometers, 20 municipal boundaries, home to more than 450,000 people, 24 conservation areas. Before we talk about some of the challenges that are facing Lake Simcoe, I wanted to start with why you became interested in the issue. I'll start with you, Dave.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, listen, for the town of Georgina and all of our residents, I mean, Lake Simcoe really is our identity. I mean, it's our drinking water, it's our recreational uses year round. You know, we're the ice fishing capital of Ontario, as an example. And so, you know, whether it's wintertime, we're out on the lake ice fishing, and certainly a large tourist attraction as well in that regard. Or whether it's in the summer, you know, going swimming, going boating, etc. So Lake Simcoe really is our identity. And I also have to add, you know, in terms of, you know, population of the lake is also, Lake Simcoe is also home to First Nations since time immemorial. And so Georgian Island First Nation is also our good friends and neighbors, and we're very proud of that.
It sounds like a truly magical place. Claire, what about you?
Well, a lot of what Dave said I would echo as well. For me, I mean, my family started cottaging in Innisfil in 1889. Wow. And so for me, you know, Lake Simcoe is sort of the environment that I studied up close, you know, crawling on my belly, doing, you know, kids' games in the woods and stuff like that, and swimming and learning to sail and canoe. So that for me, you know, is a real legacy of sort of stewardship, land stewardship, taking care, and seeing there how much work goes into having to take care of the environment, take care of a healthy forest. I became really curious about what was going on at the lake. I could observe changes, and no one around me could really explain what was happening. The Conservation Authority had some information, and so I started to explore, and I ended up creating a program, and it kind of launched my career.
You said something that I find fascinating. What do you mean by stewardship?
Well, you know, the First Nations actually were stewarding the lands that they lived on in North America, of course, for time immemorial. And so we learn from them that you have to take care of your forests. You've got to make sure that the invasive species, for example, are removed. You have to, help support the right species of trees and so on. It's sort of easier to understand in a forest, but in the lake itself, there's a lot of work that goes into protecting the species that are those keystone species that reflect to us how the lake is doing. At Lake Simcoe, that's the lake trout and whitefish. Those are the centerpiece of our of the tourism around the lake, really. And
so it's not just about enjoying it, but also taking ownership and
Yeah.
responsibility to take care of it.
That's right.
What about you, Margaret?
Well, again, similar to Dave and Claire, once you're in Simcoe County, you're going to be affiliated or have some affinity to a body of water, whether it be Wasaga Beach or Municipal Wetlands, Nottawasaga River, Lake Simcoe. And so when our coalition formed in 2017, we started off with really being concerned about water writ large in the region, and started to look into what was happening to Lake Simcoe as one of the watersheds. And the Intergovernmental Action Plan in 2006 said basically, Lake Simcoe isn't doing great because of urbanization and growth. And to the point where the scientists came out saying, we have to do something very significant because the aquaculture of the watersheds are at risk. So that actually really started delving more into, if we have these kind of warnings, what are we doing? And so we delve more into what's happening in Lake Simcoe and what's happening to these watersheds, because at the end of it, it's for the people around this panel and the people that we represent, it's really not just about water. There are livelihoods and economies and families that their futures depend on the health of that lake. It's not just a policy for us.
I want to go to Jonathan next, but you said something that maybe not everyone is familiar with. What is a watershed?
So a watershed is where it's an interconnected system of streams and wetlands and forests and aquifers, all these things that work together almost like a family to make sure that water flows and it's clean and accessible. So it's little pieces in a toolbox, if you will, that all goes together.
And what about you, Jonathan?
Growing up in Bradford, West Gwillimbury, we're the carrot capital of Canada. The Holland Marsh is known for its fertile soil, and I've always had an interest in environmental activism. One of the first things I did in high school was to demand that our MP prioritize climate change. And from university, working in the provincial government, working in the private sector for environmental NGOs, I'd always had that passion for environmental conservation stewardship and really putting the climate crisis squarely in public policy. So when I was elected about 2.5 years ago, and my ward contains most of the Holland River flowing into Lake Simcoe and a portion of the Holland Marsh, I really wanted to try to find ways practically for all levels of government to work with activists and conservation authorities to protect the lake, protect the Holland River, protect the Holland Marsh. Our farmers steward the land themselves too, and they've done a fantastic job on this, but it's governments that have let the growth happen in our region without the infrastructure, especially the environmental infrastructure that's needed to mitigate the impacts of that growth. And as municipalities, we're trying to densify and grow up near our growth train rather than out. But the sprawl has been happening for the past quarter century, and we have to do something about it.
We're going to come back to that, but you mentioned that you grew up in that region, and you're committed to it in a way that I think a lot of us maybe not familiar with. But if Lake, do you think that obviously Lake Simcoe is not one of the 5 Great Lakes, but is it just as important?
Yeah, it is. And I've even heard people call it the Little Great Lake because it is such a large lake in the middle of central Ontario. You were right when you said it's sort of the start of cottage country. And so this part of the province, we, as Dave was saying, we live on our lakes year round and enjoy them. And our economies are affiliated with them, if not based on our water. And whether it's the individual rivers, the lake itself, the marsh, we have a lot to lose if we don't protect our watersheds.
Margaret, is it just as important as the Great Lakes?
Absolutely. I mean, it is a sense of place, and I would argue that not only is Lake Simcoe important, but all of the tributaries that feed into it, all the rivers and streams, those are important to people, right? When you go into an area, you probably have places around your home that you're like, this is really important to me. So we kind of put this hierarchy of like, well, if it's big enough, then it's important, but they're all important. And Lake Simcoe, of course, being like Jonathan said, is a keystone. It supports almost a $500 million recreational economy a year. So it is important, but I would argue that all of these places that are meaningful to people that provide drinking water are important.
Well, when we talk about challenges, what does having a healthy Lake Simcoe mean for the surrounding communities, Dave?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, at the end of the day, access to clean water is important. It's important to point out our First Nation still doesn't have access to it. And I mean, it's one of the most southern First Nations there is. And so, again, going back to the original point of, protecting source point water throughout the watershed, throughout the streams, throughout the river systems, the groundwater, the aquifers, et cetera, all of which feeding into the lake. I mean, it's important that we protect them, not only in regard to, phosphorus loading and salt pollution, et cetera, but, also there's contaminated sites throughout the watershed. And so, these are things that we need to look towards other levels of government that Councillor Scott and I, and certainly Margaret and Claire have all worked in a collaborative fashion in a nonpartisan sense to get other upper levels of government, to show that commitment, because Lake Simcoe is important, for all the reasons that my colleagues here have pointed out. And so, but I think bearing in mind over and atop the recreational and the tourism aspects of the lake, which are important, and as I mentioned, Mayor Quirk, our mayor in the town of Georgina, always point out it's our identity, but it's important to note that it's our source of drinking water.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's, water is life, as the saying goes, and so, without that access to clean drinking water, none of the watershed municipalities exist, period.
You mentioned the collaboration and this being a nonpartisan issue. I want to come back to that, but I wanted to get a better understanding of what other challenges are facing Lake Simcoe. Claire?
Right, so most of the viewers, I think, would be familiar with Lake Erie and the many, many decades that we have been trying to save Lake Erie. Oh, Lake Erie's better. Oh, Lake Erie's not better.
We actually had a whole week on it.
Right? So Lake Simcoe is very similar, sort of in terms of the shape of the lake, the fact that they're relatively shallow, and the fact that they've lost a lot of wetlands, both lakes, and that there's a lot of farming in the area. So loss of natural heritage over time, those are forests and wetlands. Lots of phosphorus pollution, so this is in fertilizers. It's also in soil. It's in manure. It's in sewage, septic systems. It also falls from the sky because whenever you strip a site bare for farming or for development, and you leave it, especially if you leave it for a long time, the wind whips up that dirt and it becomes airborne. And so about 30% of the phosphorus loads that affect Lake Simcoe come from the air. So what are the factors that contribute to these things? Of course, farming. Development, though, is the one that I think we ought to focus quite a lot on. And that is because it is the growing impact on the lake. Like, farming is relatively stable. All the other sort of stressors, invasive species, they do come and go. They're a factor. But the development is the thing that we can definitely control. And of course, climate change. We can't forget climate change. These things interact with each other to create conditions that warm up the water, fertilize plants, and those conditions combine often to lower the amount of available oxygen for the fish. So we use the fish as that keystone, like, how are you doing? And the fish are not doing as well as they should be. And so we need to be paying attention to the sources of pollution that affect those conditions.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I often say growth is the original sin of a lot of these stressors, because the phosphorus runoff in particular is causing the lake to have lower oxygen levels. The plant life, you think of fertilizer as inherently a good thing for plants, but if you have too much of a good thing, it's causing stress to the lake. So we've been working collaboratively with municipalities across the watershed to convince the federal and provincial government to build a Lake Simcoe phosphorus recycling facility that will take some of the phosphorus out of the lake. Secured $40 million in federal and provincial funding to deliver it. We now want to see that funding put into action and shovels in the ground to deliver the facility. Likewise, we've been trying to find a way to, one of the bright spots in the Harper government's environmental record was something called the Lake Simcoe Cleanup Fund, but it expired in 2018. And the Trudeau Liberals are proposing to bring in a freshwater action fund of $650 million. Just this week, they announced the agency that would administer it, but we want to see that money flowing into the lake. We've had almost 5 years without the fund in place, and those environmental restoration projects that could be being funded through that money are so needed. I mean, Claire mentioned agriculture. We make our farmers do a lot of phosphorus offsetting on the farm, but we don't necessarily make the governments do the same thing.
Dave, I saw you nodding.
Oh, yeah, just I think, at the end of the day, I'm just agreeing with Councillor Scott. But yeah, I mean, a lot of work has gone into sort of, the four of us actually collectively around this table sort of lobbying, all of the watershed municipalities to sort of get on board and call on the various levels of government, whether it was the province and the Fed combined with respect to the phosphorus recycling plant, or whether it was sort of the groundswell that we worked on to call on the Trudeau Liberals to deliver on a freshwater action fund, for which John had sort of pointed out. But it's sort of perhaps a little bit novel in the watershed for municipalities to work together in this way. But it's been really successful with the groundswell from citizens and ENGOs, municipal governments, conservation authority, et cetera. Yeah.
You say it's novel for the municipalities to work together. I think it's refreshing to see people across political parties work in this way, because as you mentioned from the very beginning, this is about sort of stewardship, right?
It's the one area where the Conservatives want the Liberals to spend more money. It's great. It's nonpartisan in that sense.
Yeah, I just wanted to be a little blunt with it too. All the things that Claire and Jonathan and Dave mentioned is true, but to really cut through, the greatest threat to Lake Simcoe is political will, the lack of political will at the higher levels and the provincial levels. So, I am starting to feel there's a lot of performative politics with, we love Lake Simcoe, we're going to put on our campaign materials, we're going to wrap ourselves in that flag when we go to farmers markets, and the hypocrisy of it, especially with this particular provincial government, of we love Lake Simcoe, we're going to make sure that it's protected, and at the same time drive highways through its watershed, at the same time remove endangered species protection, at the same time break greenbelt promises and cut out those supportive things, cut out protections for wetlands. These things are exactly opposite of what the science says we need to do. We have a climate crisis that's here, and it's going to be getting worse. And the fact is, unless the feds and the provincial MPPs stop feeling like it's just a vote getter, it's something just to make it seem like we really care, but then follow up with policies that are absolutely destructive, then it doesn't really, I'm just tired of the hollowness of it all.
We will not applaud that kind of behavior. So I just want to...
I'm going to come to Jonathan after that. But
okay.
Go ahead.
I want to point out what the province has to do. So the province passed in 2008 the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan. This is the best watershed-based legislation in Canada. I mean, the Great Lakes, some of the Great Lakes Protection Act is based on this. So we have the best. To Margaret's point, this has to be delivered. You have to pay attention, you've got to do the science, you've got to implement, you have to make tough decisions, such as, we're not going to let you build here because there's no sewage capacity, right? Or you're going to have to really increase the amount of water conservation that you do if you want to build here. There are lots of very innovative tools in this Lake Simcoe Protection Plan that make growth pay for growth. And arguably, this is what we should be doing across Southern Ontario to mitigate the impacts of growth. So there are programs that reduce the amount of stormwater that would flow quickly off a site for new development. There are ways to get money from developers if their projects do contribute phosphorus pollution to the Lake Simcoe watershed. And unfortunately, those are two programs that the Government of Ontario has started to mess with. They're some of the most interesting, innovative, and important pieces of it. So it's been really frustrating for us to not be able to have much dialogue with the provincial government about this very important lake and the implementation of its plan. We want greater access to decision makers, and if that was happening, you might not see this really interesting partnership that we have here with our municipal politicians. But we will work with anybody who will work with us. And that's why we're working with these guys. And we're all together trying to get the province to do the homework that's written right here.
Jonathan, I wanted to just give you an opportunity to respond, because how do you balance that need for the infrastructure like the Bradford bypass with development and also protecting the environment?
Well, I think in part by following the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan. And if you're going to do any sort of development, it has to be sustainable development. And whether that means offsets or mitigation, doing things differently, scrutinizing things properly, I don't want to say any individual thing is inherently bad. It has to be done properly. And so whether we agree or disagree on a particular piece of infrastructure, the process actually matters, and the public confidence in that process is paramount as well.
I didn't want to put you on the spot, but I think you gave me an answer, but I'll take what you said. Dave?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I can add really to what the group has said is, it's truly about the process. Our council was pretty clear, I believe back in 2020, 2021, somewhere in around there, where we asked the provincial government quite clearly by way of resolution, which was unanimous, was, to follow the existing policies that are on the books and go through the process and voluntarily, in fact, involve the Conservation Authority as an oversight body. And so, we've been pretty clear in the town is that, we understand the need and we live it every day with respect to east-west connections. It can be very difficult. So, but at the end of the day, it's about the process. And so, I guess what everyone here would agree upon is if you're going to do it, you need to do it properly. You need to respect the natural environment. And, that may take all sorts of different forms. But to Jonathan's point is that, the public has to have confidence in that process.
Is it about the process, Margaret?
Well, I think I'll just backtrack a little bit that the public should have zero public confidence in this process. I mean, we're dealing with studies that are over 30 years old. They changed the Environmental Assessment Act to streamline it, which basically renders it meaningless there's very little legislative responsibilities that they have to do once they find out there's problems. Lake Simcoe isn't being studied. Cumulative impacts to the climate are not being studied. We have air pollution. When you asked Jonathan the question of is it a benefit, I think benefit did a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, because what is the benefit when you increase air pollution, where you're having children and older people with more Alzheimer's and asthma and lung-related diseases because of the proximity to the highway? What is the benefit of a $2 to $4 billion highway that'll be one of the most expensive highways that Ontario has built in recent history? What is the benefit of pouring an enormous amount of salt into the headwaters of Lake Simcoe, which supports a regional economic tourism? There really is not a lot of benefit, and what we have seen is as government continues to push through, they dole out the misinformation, and at the same time conveniently roll out the we love the greenbelt, we love the lake, we care about our environment, and intentionally change policies and laws to make it so they don't have to follow their own rules. They are writing the rules of the test, they're writing the test, they're answering the test, they're marking the test. What kind of process is that?
And in fairness, I just want to point out that the government was reelected in part because they said that they would be building more infrastructure, more highways. I just thought I should just mention that. Claire, you brought us some pictures of Lake Simcoe. Can you tell us, I'm going to bring them up and you can tell us what it is that we're looking at. Oh my gosh.
This is farmland. This is Innisfil. And right behind that line of trees is a subdivision that was approved more than 10 years ago. It's this kind of landscape where we grow food, where water can sink through the soil, recharge our groundwater and our aquifers. This is really important part of the landscape, and it's just interesting how I think it hides the fact that now there's a subdivision going in right behind.
We have another one too over there.
Yeah, this is just a pretty naturalized shoreline with a bit of an awkward old piece of concrete on the shore. My son exploring the shore. So people use the lake in all sorts of fun and interesting ways. Oh, this is a nasty one. This is what would happen if we do not take care of Lake Simcoe. This is actually at Lake Simcoe. This is duckweed in a little inlet in the Georgina area somewhere about 15 years ago. So this is what happens when you have too much fertilizer, not enough water flow. The weeds and aquatic plants just grow like crazy, and it chokes out other life. And so
we have a final picture here.
Oh yeah, well this is Big Bay Point. Now Friday Harbor, this was supposed to be good for the lake, right? Massive development. I mean, you can just see the scale of something like this. Like there were Blandings turtles in here. This is the kind of development that is a threat to the integrity of the natural systems that have to stay connected throughout the watershed. I do want to point out one thing that the lake absolutely needs is natural heritage protection. So like the rest of Ontario, we have provincial policies that protect significant forests, provincially significant wetlands. We are concerned that the government might weaken those policies, and that would be disastrous for Lake Simcoe and for the rest of Southern Ontario. You know, we've lost something like 90% of the original wetlands in the very southern part of of Ontario and Lake Erie area, you can see what that does, right? So we need to protect the natural heritage. That helps filter pollutants. It helps store stormwater. You know, we have to address what climate change is bringing to us. And Lake Simcoe is really just a reflection of what is coming to other places. It is the poster child for what we have to do to take care of our environment if we want to have good, clean water for recreation, boating, drinking, all the life processes for all the critters and fish that live in the lake.
Who has jurisdiction over Lake Simcoe?
Well, no, Ontario. I mean, it should be much easier to manage than the Great Lakes because it's entirely within Ontario. Ontario is responsible for administering the Lake Simcoe Protection Act and Plan, but Conservation Authority, well, less now because the province has gutted a lot of those responsibilities, but the Conservation Authority has quite a lot of responsibility. So do the municipalities, and so do residents and citizen groups like ours.
Jonathan?
Well, it's funny you ask who has jurisdiction over the lake because I've actually heard municipal leaders argue, well, I don't have jurisdiction over that precisely, but we all do, every level of government, and it has to work collaboratively. And our region is so rapidly growing, and it's not going to stop. We are the region, more than most, where they are looking to put a lot of the housing to deal with the housing affordability crisis, but we have to do it in a smart and sustainable way, not more sprawl, which is what has happened for the last quarter century. And so we can talk about all the infrastructure that hasn't been kept up. We still don't have a twin GO train to deliver regional express rail in and out of the city. I think Margaret came down on the GO train today and it took her 2 hours to get to the middle of Toronto. That should be much easier. So we need all levels of government. Dave and I have spoken to some initiatives that we've done, but it has to be much more macro than that because I'm either the fastest growing municipality in the province in Bradford, and if it's not us that year, it's our neighbors in East Gwillimbury. So that responsibility to follow the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan, respect the role of conservation authorities, work with the development community to do things properly, especially around density, especially around transit. Those are some of the really macro solutions we need to explore. And it has a ripple effect, no pun intended, on everything else we're talking about. If you talk about traffic congestion versus the environment, that's a false choice because what we actually have to talk about is how do you have development done in a sustainable way so people have places to live, but we're not at the same time compromising our drinking water or compromising our natural habitat that holds it all and is where we all live at the end of the day.
There seems to be a disconnect from people who live in the GTA to what's happening outside of the GTA. Is there a little bit of frustration for you?
Well, yes, especially in Bradford, because we're sort of the northernmost municipality in the GTA and the southernmost in South Simcoe. We've been a suburb for the past 15 years or more, and managing how that works within a county that's much more rural, agricultural, and even cottage country is its own set of challenges. But I think what I would just say to your question around how is this perceived from Toronto versus how is this perceived from Lake Simcoe, we see the results right away. Claire showed a photo of a beautiful farm with a subdivision behind it. People don't necessarily like that. It's not NIMBYism so much as it is a desire to see growth happen properly, whether that's having transportation networks, whether that's having environmental respect and mitigation, or even whether that's having the community centers and the good cultural places you need. We're a region growing so fast that we have to be able to manage it, and it is going to take all levels of government. It's also going to take activists reminding levels of government when we get it wrong.
Margaret, what would you like the federal and provincial governments to do in terms of investment?
I would like to see to reestablish the investments that they had promised with the phosphorus reduction, but I want them to actually do the jobs that they're supposed to be doing, which is write the good policy based on science, don't corner cut, make sure that you're supporting people so that we have a clean lake and a livable climate for the future. What we see now is abdication of responsibility, and that's just not going to cut it.
We reached out to the government because we were talking about this, and we received a statement from the Office of the Ministry of Transportation. Just a reminder, this is just partial what the statement was. The government says, Ontario's population is growing rapidly and we need new infrastructure to keep our people and goods moving while strengthening our economy. The Bradford bypass is being built in accordance with Ontario's robust environmental assessment EA process. We are currently undertaking work to update the original EA for the project, which includes 16 environmental studies. Despite attempts from our opponents to maintain the status quo, our government is building critical transportation infrastructure, including the Bradford bypass, which communities of Simcoe County and York Region overwhelmingly support. I would like to get a reaction from all of you. Dave, I'll start with you.
Certainly. I mean, nothing new there, from my perspective with respect to the statement. But look, I mean, they talk about updating the EAs and the appropriate studies. And so, I mean, that's good. That's something that our council had very specifically asked for. I hope that come the future, they also voluntarily involve the Conservation Authority with respect to oversight. That's something as well our council's asked for. But look, at the end of the day, I understand they have a mandate and they were elected, in part based upon the bypass. And so at some level, we recognize from the east-west perspective in Georgina is we do have a bit of a challenge there without some sort of additional connection to the Trans-Canada from the 404. So,
Margaret?
Well, I think that it's interesting that the status quo, no one here on this panel is going to say that we don't need infrastructure, that we don't need to move people, and we don't need houses, but this government only knows how to think in gray and remove green. And so we want to see transit, we want to see those places built that are vibrant, that help both of their communities. And as far as maintaining the status quo, I mean, frankly, they are building from the playbook of the 1950s of how you build communities. You pave over this and you build some houses in a subdivision, you cut out the farms. That is the status quo. They are the harbingers of status quo. We are the ones saying, look, we've improved technology. Communities and other jurisdictions have gone past this 50, 70-year experiment of suburbia. We're trying to actually bring you into the future, not drag you from the past here.
Thank you all for coming in to Toronto all this way. We really appreciate your time and expertise and helping us understand this issue. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Tomorrow on the agenda.
They don't care what we do to the animals as long as they can get back to sleep and they no longer hear this noise in the house. When we go up in the attic and we remove the babies that you saw in the video and we go down into the house, we take a moment to show them the babies. And they do a complete 180 in their thinking that they wanted the animals killed. The next words out of their mouth are, "You're not going to hurt them, are you?"
That's tomorrow on the agenda.